Gormenghast. Chapter 39. Barquentine in his room sat with his withered leg drawn up to his chin. His hair, dirty as a fly-blown web, hung about his face, dry and lifeless. His skin, equally filthy with its silted fissures, its cheese-like cracks and discolorations, was also dry. An arid terrain, dead it seemed, and waterless as the moon, and yet, at its centre, those malignant lakes, his vile and brimming eyes. Outside the broken window at the far end of the room lay stretched the stagnant waters of the moat. He had been sitting there, his only leg drawn up to his face, his crutch leaning against the back of his chair, his hands clasped about his knee, a hank of his beard between his teeth. He had been sitting there for over an hour. On the table before him at least a dozen books lay spread. Books of ritual and precedence, books of cross-reference, ciphers and secret papers. But his eyes were not on them. No less ruthless for being out of focus and gleaming wetly in their dry sockets, they could not see that a shadow had entered the room, that, intangible as air, yet graphic to a degree, it had reared itself against high tiers of books of all shapes and in every stage of dilapidation, that glimmered in the bad light, save where his shadow lay athwart them, black as a shade from hell. And while he sat there, what was he thinking of, this wrinkled and filthy dwarf? He was thinking of how a change had come over the workings of Gormenghast, over the workings of its heart and the temper of its brain. Something so subtle that he could in no way fix upon it. Something that was not to be located in the normal way of his thinking, yet something which, nevertheless, was filling his nostrils with its odour. He knew it to be evil, and what was evil in the eyes of Barquentine was anything that smelt of insurrection, anything that challenged or worked to undo the ancient procedures. Gormenghast was not what it was. He knew it. There was devilry somewhere among these cold stones, and yet he could not put his finger upon the spot. He could not say what it was that was now so different. It was not that he was an old man. He was not sentimental about the days of his youth. They had been dark and loveless, but he had no pity for himself. He had only this blind, passionate and cruel love for the dead letter of the castle's law. He loved it with a love as hot as his hate. For the members of the Groan line itself, he had less regard than for the meanest and drearest of the rituals that it was their destiny to perform. Only in so far as they were symbols did he bow his ragged head. He had no love for Titus, only for his significance as the last of the links in the great chain. There was something about the way the boy moved, a restlessness and independence that galled him. It was almost as though this heir to a world of towers had learned from other climes, of warm, clandestine lands, and that the febrile and erratic movements of the child's limbs were the reflection of what lived and throve in his imagination. It was as though his brain, in regions remote and seductive, was sending its unsettling messages to the small bones, to the tissues of the boy, so that there was in his movements something remote and ominous. But Barquentine, knowing that the 77th Earl had never moved as far as a day's journey from his birthplace, spat, as it were, these reflections from his puzzled brain. And yet the taste lingered, the taste of something acid, something rebellious. The young Earl was too much himself. It was as though the child imagined he had a life of his own apart from the life of Gormenghast. And he was not the only one. There was this steerpike youth. A quick, useful disciple, no doubt, but a danger for that very reason. What was to be done about him? He had learned too much. He had opened books that were not for him to open and found his way about too rapidly. There was something about him that set him apart from the life of the place, something subtly foreign, something ulterior. Barquentine shifted his body on the chair, growling with irritation both at the twinge which the altering of his position gave to his withered leg, and at the frustration of being unable to do more than gnaw at the fringe of his suspicions. He longed, as master of the grown law, to take action, to stamp out, if necessary, a score of malcontents, but there was nothing clear, no tangible target, nothing definable upon which he could direct his fire. He only knew that were he to discover that Steerpike had in the smallest degree abused the grudging trust he had placed in him, then, bringing all his authority to bear, he would have the pallid snipe from the Tower of Flints. He would strike with the merciless venom of the fanatic for whom the world holds no gradations, only the blind extremes of black and white. To sin was to sin against Gormenghast. Evil and doubt were one. To doubt the sacred stones was to profane the Godhead. And there was this evil somewhere, close but invisible. His sense caught a whiff of it, but as soon as he turned his brain, as it were, over the shoulder of his mind, it was gone, and there was nothing palpable, nothing but the hierophants, moving here and there upon this business or that, and seemingly absorbed. Was there no way for him either to snare this wandering evil and turn its face to the light, or to quell his suspicions? For they were harmful, keeping him awake through the long night hours, nagging at him as though the castle's illness were his own. "By the blood of hell," he whispered, and his whisper was like grit, "I will search it out, though it hide like a bat in the vaults or a rat in the southern lofts." He scratched himself disgustingly, rumps and crutch, and again he shifted himself on the high chair. It was then that the shadow that lay across the bookshelves moved a little. The shoulders appeared to rise as the whole silhouette shifted itself further from the door, and the impalpable body of the thing rippled across 100 leather spines. Barquentine's eyes took focus for a moment or two as they strayed over the documents on the table before him, and, unsolicited at the moment, the recollection of having once been married returned to him. What had happened to his wife he could not remember. He assumed that she had died. He had no recollection of her face, but could remember, and perhaps it was the sight of the papers before him that had brought back the unwelcome memory, how, as she wept, she would, hardly knowing that she was doing so, make paper boats, which, wet with her tears and grimed from her cracked hands, she sailed across the harbour of her lap, or left stranded about the floor, or on the rope matting of her bed, in throngs, like fallen leaves, wet, grimed, and delicate, in scattered squadrons, a navy of grief and madness. And then, with a start, he remembered that she had borne him a son. Or was it she? It was over 40 years since he had spoken to his child. He would be hard to find, but found he must be. All he remembered was that a birthmark took up most of the face and that the eyes were crossed. With his mind cast back to earlier days, a number of pictures floated hesitantly before his eyes, and in all of them he saw himself as someone with his head perpetually raised, as someone on a level with men's knees, as a target for gibes and scorn. He could see in his mind's eye the growth of hatred. He could feel again his crutch being kicked from beneath him, and of the urchins hooting in his wake, "Rotten leg! Rotten spine! Hya! Hya! Barquentine!" All that was over. He was feared now, feared and hated. With his back to the door and to the bookshelves, he could not see that the shadow had moved again. He lifted his head and spat. Picking up a piece of paper, he began to make a boat, but he did not know what he was doing. "It has gone on long enough," he said to himself. "Too long, by the blood of hags! He must go. He is finished, dead, over, done with. I must be alone, or the cock of the great ape'll jeopardize the inner secrets. He'll have the keys off me with his bloody efficiency." And while he muttered in his own throat, the shadow of the youth for whom he was speaking slid inexorably over the spines, and came to a stop 12 feet from Barquentine. But the body of Steerpike was at the same moment immediately behind the cripple's chair. It had not been easy for the young man to decide in what way he would kill his master. He had many means at his disposal. His nocturnal visits to the doctor's dispensary had furnished him with a sinister array of poisons. His sword-stick was almost too obviously efficacious. His catapult was no toy, but something lethal as a gun and silent as a sword. He knew of ways to break the neck with the edge of the palm, and he knew how to send a penknife through the air with extraordinary precision. He had not, for nothing, spent an allotted number of minutes every morning and for several years in throwing his knife at the dummy in his bedroom. But he was not interested merely in dispatching the old man. He had to kill him in some way which left no trace, to dispose of the body and at the same time to mix pleasure and business in such a compound that neither was the weaker for their union. He had old scores to pay off. He had been spat upon and reviled by the withered cripple. To merely stop his life in the quickest way would be an empty climax, something to be ashamed of. But what really happened, and how Barquentine really died in Steerpike's presence, bore no relation to the plan which the young man had made. For, as he stood immediately behind his victim's chair, the old man leaned forward across his books and papers and pulled towards himself a rusty, 3-armed candlestick, and after a great deal of scrabbling about among his rags, eventually set a light to the wicks. This had the double effect of sending Steerpike's shadow sidling across the book-filled wall and sucking the strength out of it. From where Steerpike stood, he could see over Barquentine's shoulder the honey-coloured flames of the 3 candles. They were the shapes of bamboo leaves, attenuate and slender, and they trembled against the darkness. Barquentine himself was silhouetted against the glow of the candlelight, and suddenly, as his body shifted, and Steerpike obtained an even clearer view of the candle flame, an idea occurred to the young man which made all his carefully prepared plans for the death and disposal of the ancient's body appear amateurish. Amateurish through lack of that deceptive simplicity which is the hallmark of all great art. Amateurish for all their ingenuity and for the very reason of it. But here before him, ready-made, was a candlestick with 3 gold flames that licked at the sullen air. And here within his reach was the old man he wished to kill, but not too quickly. An old man whose rags and skin and beard were as dry and inflammable as the most exacting of fire-raisers could wish. What would be easier than for a man as ancient as Barquentine to lean forward accidentally at his work, and for his beard to catch light from the candles? What would be more diverting than to watch the irritable and filthy tyrant caught among flames, his rags blazing, his skin smoking, his beard leaping like a crimson fish? It would only remain, at a later date, for Steerpike to discover the charred corpse and arouse the castle. The young man glanced about him. The door through which he had entered the room was closed. It was an hour when there was small chance of their being disturbed. The silence in the room was only intensified by the thin grating of Barquentine's breathing. No sooner had Steerpike realized the advantages of setting fire to the ragged silhouette which squatted like a black gnome immediately before him than he drew the blade from his sword stick and raised it so that the steel point hovered within an inch of Barquentine's neck and immediately below his left ear. Now that Steerpike was so close upon the heels of the gross and bloody deed, a kind of cold and poisonous rage filled him. Perhaps the dry root of some long-deadened conscience stirred for a moment in his breast. Perhaps, for that sharp second, he remembered, in spite of himself, that to kill a man involved a sense of guilt. And perhaps it was because of the momentary distraction of purpose that hatred swept his face, as though a frozen sea were whipped of a sudden into a living riot of tameless water. But the waves subsided as quickly as they had risen. Once again his face was white with a deadly equipoise. The point of his blade had trembled beneath the age-bitten ear, but now it was motionless. It was then that there was a knock at the door. The old head twisted to the sound, but away from the blade, so that Steerpike and his weapon were still invisible.
"To black hell with you, whoever you are! I will see no son of a bitch today!"
"Very well, sir," said a door-blocked voice, and then the faint sound of footsteps could be heard, and then silence again. Barquentine turned his head back and then scratched himself across the belly.
"Saucy bullfrog," he muttered aloud. "I'll have his face off him. I'll have his white face off. I'll have the shine off it. By the gall of the great mule, he's over shiny. Very well, sir, he says, does he? What's well about it? What's well about it, the upstart pissworm?"
Again Barquentine began to scratch loins, buttocks, belly, and ribs.
"Oh, sucking fire!" he cried. "It gripes my heart. No earl, but a brat. The countess, cat mad. And for me, no tyro, but this upstart of a Steerpike bastard."
The young man, his sword-stick beautifully poised, its cold tip sharp as a needle, pursed his thin lips and clicked his tongue. This time Barquentine turned his head over his left shoulder so that he received half an inch of steel beneath his ear. His body stiffened horribly while his throat swelled into a semblance of a scream, but no scream came. When Steerpike withdrew the blade, and while a trickle of dark blood made its way over the wrinkled terrain of his turtleneck, the whole frame became all of a sudden convulsively active, each part of him seeming to contort itself without relation to what was happening to the rest of the body. It was a miracle that he remained balanced on the high chair. But these convulsions suddenly ended, and Steerpike, standing back with his chin cupped in his hands, was chilled, in spite of the half-smile on his face, by the direst expression of mortal hatred that had ever turned an old man's face into a nest of snakes. The eyes grew of a sudden, congested, their vile waters taking on, it seemed, the flush of a dangerous sunrise. The mouth and the lines about it appeared to seethe. The dirty brow and neck were wet with venom. But there was a brain behind it all. A brain which, while Steerpike stood by and smiled, was in spite of the young man's initial advantage a step ahead of the youth. For the one thing without which he would indeed have been helpless was still in his power to capture. Steerpike had made a mistake at the outset, and he was taken completely by surprise when Barquentine, thrusting himself off the high chair, fell to the floor in a heap. The old man landed upon the object which was his only hope. It had fallen to the ground when he had stiffened at the sword prick, And now in a flash he had grasped his crutch, prized himself upright, and hopped to the rear of his chair, through the bars of which he directed his red gaze upon the face of his armed and agile enemy. But the spirit in the old tyrant was something so intense that Steerpike, in spite of his 2 legs, his youth, and his weapons, was taken aback by the realization that so much passion could be housed in so dry and stunted a thing. He was also taken aback at having been outwitted. It was true that even now the duel was ludicrously one-sided, an ancient cripple with a crutch, an athlete with a sword, but nevertheless, had his first action been to remove the crutch, he would now have the old man in as helpless a position as a tortoise upon his back. For a few moments they faced one another, Barquentine expressing everything in his face, Steerpike nothing. Then the young man began to walk slowly backwards to the door, his eyes all the while on his quarry. He was taking no chances. Barquentine had shown how quick he could be. When he reached the door, he opened it and took a rapid glance along the attenuate corridor. It was enough to show him that there was no one in the neighborhood. He closed the door behind him and then began to advance towards the chair, through the bars of which the dwarf was peering. As Steerpike advanced with his slender steel in his hand, his eyes were upon his prey, but his thoughts were centered upon the candlestick. His foe could have no idea of how he was within reach of what would burn him up. The 3 little flames trembled above the melting wax. He had brought them to life, those 3 dead lumps of tallow, and they were to turn upon him, but not yet. Steerpike continued his lethal advance. What was there that the cripple could do? For a moment he was partially shielded by the back of the chair. And then, in a voice strangely at variance with the demoniac aspect of his face, for he was as cold as ice, he uttered the one word,
"Traitor!"
It was not merely his life he was fighting for. That single word, freezing in the air, had revealed what Steerpike had forgotten, that in his adversary he was pitting himself against Gormenghast. Before him he had a living pulse of the immemorial castle. But what of all this? It merely meant that Steerpike must be careful, that he must keep his distance until the moment in which to make his attack. He continued to advance, and then, when another step would have taken him within range of Barquentine's crutch, he sidestepped to the right, and speeding to the far end of the table, placed his rapier before him across the littered books, and taking his knife from his pocket, opened it with a single action, and then, as Barquentine turned about in his tracks in order to face his assailant, he sent the sharp thing whipping through the candlelight. As Steerpike had intended, it pinned the old man's right hand to the shaft of his crutch. In a moment of Barquentine's surprise and pain, Steerpike leapt to the table and sprang along it. Immediately below him, the dwarf plucked at the knife in his blind fury. As he did so, Steerpike, all in a breath, had snatched up the candlestick and, lunging forward, swept the tiny flame across the upturned face. In a moment, the lifeless beard had shone out in sizzling fire, and it was but a moment before the rotten rags about the shoulders of the old man were ablaze also. But again, and this time, while in the throes of mortal agony, Barquentine's brain had risen instantaneously to the call which was made upon it. He had no moment to lose. The knife was still in his hand, though the crutch had fallen away. But all that was forgotten, as with a superhuman effort, one-legged though he was, he flexed his knee, and in a spring caught hold of some portion of Steerpike's clothing. No sooner had he made his first grip, than with his arms straining themselves to breaking point, and his old heart pounding, he made good his purchase, and began to swarm the youth like an ape on fire. By now he had a grip of Steerpike's waist, and the flames were beginning to catch the clothing of his young enemy. the searing pain across his face and chest but made him cling the tighter. That he must die he knew, but the traitor must die with him, and in his agony there was something of joy in the rightness of his revenge. At the same time, Steerpike was fighting to free himself, clawing at the burning leech, striking upwards with his knees, his face transparent with a deadly mixture of rage, astonishment, and desperation. His clothes, less inflammable than Barquentine's threadbare sacking, were nevertheless alight by now, and across his cheek and throat a flame had scorched his skin to crimson. But the more he struggled to wrench himself away, the fiercer seemed the arms that gripped his waist. Had anyone opened the door, they would have seen, at that moment, a young man luminous against the darkness, his feet striking and trampling among the sacred books that littered the table, the body writhing and straining as though demented, and they would have seen that his vibrating hands were locked upon the turtle throat of a dwarf on fire. And they would have seen the paroxysm that toppled the combatants off the table's edge so that they fell in a smoking heap to the floor. Even now, in his pain and danger, there was room in him for bitter shame of his failure. Steerpike, the arch-contriver, the cold and perfect organizer, had bungled the affair. He had been out-generalled by a verminous septuagenarian, but his shame took the form of desperate anger. It whipped him to a fever pitch. In a kind of spasm, quite diabolical in the excess of its ferocity and purpose, he struggled to his knees, and then with a jerk to his feet. He had let go the throat, and he stood swaying a moment, his hands free at his sides, and the pain of his burn so intense that although he did not know it, he was moaning like something lost. It had nothing to do with his merciless nature, this moaning. It was something quite physical. It was his body crying. His brain knew nothing about it. The master of ritual clung like a vampire at his breast. The old arms were clasped about him. Mixed with the pain in the agonized face, there was an unholy glee. He was burning the traitor with his own flame. He was burning an unbeliever. But the unbeliever was, for all the fiery hugging of his master, by no means ready for sacrifice, however right or deserving his death might be. He had paused only to regain strength. He had dropped his arms only through an abnormal degree of control. He knew that he could not free himself from the clutch of the fanatic. And so for a moment he stood there, upright, his coat half burned away, his head thrust back to keep as great a distance as he could between his face and the flames that rose from the blackening creature that clung like a growth. To be able to stand for a moment under so horrific a duress, to be able to stand, to take a deep breath and to relax the muscles of his arms demanded an almost inhuman control of the will and the passions. The circumstances having gone so far beyond his control, there was no longer any question of choice. It was no longer a case of killing Barquentine. It was a case of saving himself. His plans had gone so wildly astray that there was no recovery. He was ablaze. There was only one thing he could do. Saddled as he was, his limbs were disencumbered. He knew that he had only a few moments in which to act. His head swam, and a darkness filled him, but he began to run, his burned hands spread out like starfish at his sides, to run in a dizzy curve of weakness to the far end of the room, to where the night was a square of darkness. For a moment they were there, against the starless sky, lit like demons with their own conflagration, and then, suddenly, they were gone. Steerpike had hurdled the window-sill and had fallen with his virulent burden into the black waters of the moat below. There were no stars, but the moon, like a nail-paring, floated unsubstantially in the low north. It cast no light upon the earth. Deep in the horrible waters of the moat, the protagonists, their consciousness having left them, still moved together as one thing, like some foul subaqueous beast of allegory. Above them, the surface water through which they had fallen was sizzling, and steam drifted up, invisible, through the darkness. When after what he could only recall as his death, Steerpike, his head having at last risen above the surface, found that he was not alone, but that something clung to him below the water, he vomited, and of a sudden howled. But the nightmare continued, and there was no answer to his howl. He did not waken. And then the excruciating pains of his burns racked him, and he knew it was no dream. And then he realized what he must do. He must keep that charred and hairless head which kept bobbing against his breast. He must keep it below the water. But it was not easy for him to fasten upon the wrinkled throat. The mud had been churned up about them, and the burden he carried was like his own hands, coated with slime. The vile arms clung about him with the tenacity of tentacles. That he did not sink like a stone was a wonder. Perhaps it was the thickness of the water, or the violent stamping of his feet in the stagnant depth, which helped him to keep afloat for long enough. But gradually, inexorably, he fought the old head backwards, his fierce hands clenched on the gullet strings. He fought it downwards, down into the black water, while bubbles rose and the thick and slapping sound of the agitated water filled up the hollow of the glistening night. There was no knowing how long the old man's face remained under water before Steerpike could feel any loosening of the grip at his waist. To the murderer, the act of death was endless. But by degrees the lungs had filled with water, and the heart had ceased to beat, and the hereditary keeper of the grown law and master of ritual had slid away into the muddy depths of the ancient moat. The moon was higher in the sky, was surrounded by a sprinkling of stars. It could not be said that they gave light to the walls and towers that flanked the moat, but a kind of dusk was inlaid upon the inky darkness, a dusk in the shape of walls and towers. Exhausted and in terrible pain, Steerpike had yet to swim on through the scum and duckweed, to swim on until the slimy walls of the moat gave way on the northern side to a muddy bank. It seemed that the walls on his either side were endless. The foul water got into his throat. The vile weeds clung to his face. It was difficult to see more than a few yards ahead, but all at once he realized that the wall upon his right had given way to a steep and muddy bank. The water had drawn away what clothes the fire had left. He was naked, covered with burns, half drowned, his body shaking with an icy cold, his brow burning with a feverish heat. Crawling up the bank, not knowing what he was doing, save that he must find some place of neither fire nor water, he came at last to a patch of level mud, where a few rank ferns and mud plants flourished, and there, as though, now that his affairs were concluded, he could afford to faint, he collapsed into darkness. And there he lay motionless, very small and naked on the mud, like something lifeless that had been discarded, or like a fish thrown up by the sea over whose minute and stranded body the great cliffs tower, for the walls of Gormenghast rose high above the moat, soaring like cliffs themselves into the upper darkness.